Welcome to the Hyper Guy Motivational Podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. Today I have an amazing guest that I've been, oh my God, I've been asking her, been trying to get her on for a while, probably a couple months now. Dr. Akila Kadambi. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me here.
So let me give you a little bit of background on our doctor here today. She is a neuroscientist and researcher at UCLA and USC. She works at the Brain Research Center at UCLA. She received her doctorate and a PhD from UCLA in 2022. Her focus is in the area of cognitive psychology. She has a BS in cognitive science. And I guess you have to explain exactly. I know you have like a bunch of other stuff on top of that. So, and I know you focus on qualitative neuroscience and a minor in psychology, correct?
No. So I did. My degree was. You're saying back in the day in undergrad?
Yes, in undergrad.
Yeah, in undergrad I studied cognitive science with an emphasis in quantitative methods.
In quantitative.
Yeah, but now I intersect. I do a lot of quantitative, qualitative, but now I would say my research is more so aligned with cognitive neuroscience work.
So can you give me an idea what specifically you're doing now in your job now? Then I'm gonna go into your background a little bit, and then I'm gonna start asking you some specific questions specifically about developing pro-social behavior and so forth, and why it's important and so forth.
Yeah. So so my research examines. I would say broadly it examines the neural basis for empathy, and I look at all these different dimensions of empathy. We look at cognitive empathy, which is more of social reasoning, as well as more affective feelings of empathy. We use different methods. So typically we use a combination of behavioral assessments, neuroscience methods like functional neuroimaging, and then also non-invasive forms of brain stimulation like transcranial magnetic stimulation. And all of it is really to shed light on the fact that we as human beings are pretty interconnected, and we want to understand how our brain is able to really represent that information.
So now I get to do the fun part, the initial fun part for me is where were you born and raised?
I was born in California. I was raised in California. Lived in California my whole life. I have never left California to live, so I've been here my whole life. But I've traveled a lot. I've gotten a lot of other experience. But yeah, California native.
And what was it like growing up in California? I know you're from the Bay Area, the Greater Bay Area. I'll put it that way. What was your childhood like growing up?
These are deep questions. My childhood was good. It was really good. I was raised in a great area. I think I had a pretty strong academic focus. So I did a lot of learning and, lived in pretty much a very quiet, nice suburban area. And then I just, did my thing. And then in college is really where I discovered that I was interested in this inner machinery and in studying the brain.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Like when you're in high school, because I know that you've enjoyed academics your whole life, and I know your parents were pretty academic as well. What made you choose neuroscience? Like what light bulb went off, and why was it important to you?
Yeah, so my first year of my undergrad, I actually was accepted with a completely different major, but I decided to take an introductory course that had pretty much different rotating professors come in and talk about their research. And I took it kind of just on a whim, and it was, related to cognitive science methods, which broadly included neuroscience and computer science and psychology and anthropology and all of these different disciplines. And I thought it was just the coolest thing that I could really learn about. It was super interesting. But I was very curious. I was always curious in the brain. But then as I sort of continued and went on with my learning about the brain, so from there I continued studying the brain. It was really, I would say, in my PhD where things really clicked, where I was like, this is totally what I want to do. As an undergrad, I was always very interested in it. I was curious. I thought it was very, it controls everything. But during my PhD, I understood why I wanted to do it and what was important about studying the brain.
So when you're undergrad, I want to ask you this question as a baseline. Like, what the heck is neuroscience?
Yes, I mean, we still don't know. Big, we don't have a good sense of it, right? So I'm actually part of a fellowship here at UCLA, which intersects neuroscience and society. And the way that we define neuroscience in that context is very different from the way we define it in traditional research methods. And neuroscience is very broad. So you can have cognitive neuroscience, which is where the kind of work that I typically do. There's also systems neuroscience, which is studying how systems in the brain interact, which is also some of the work that I do. And then you can go really reductionistically. You can go as broad as you want. You can ultimately get into philosophy, and we would consider philosophers neuroscientists too. So there isn't one definition of neuroscience. There's a lot.
So when you started studying this in your undergrad, what kind of piqued your interest in, because eventually you applied for your PhD, what piqued your interest in that undergraduate? Was there any particular area of study that really, really like, this is where you said you focus on the cognitive side. And I guess, let me ask you a broader, another definition. What is cognitive? What does that mean?
Yeah. So cognitive is kind of like the how, I would say, like how does the brain do certain things? There's different ways of studying the brain, as we were just talking about. You can look at more of the material, like look at the kind of soft components of the brain. I would say that's more of like what they traditionally do in wet lab work. Cognitive is almost intersecting a little bit more high level study of the brain and trying to understand how do we represent different constructs in the brain. It's really the how question. And so what was your first question? Sorry, I think I zoned out a little when I was talking.
No, that's basically, I wanted to get to that portion of what kind of, was there anything in your undergrad, I guess?
Oh, yes.
That kind of like said, this is what I want to do. I mean, this is what kind of like, this is amazing, or what kind of like tipped you? Because when you go to a PhD program, that's a big jump, because that means that's something that you're going to probably spend the remainder of your life studying, right? Or it's such a big part of your life. So why was it so important for you to study?
Yeah. So when I was an undergrad, that was where as I was saying, I had taken this course, and there was actually a professor who had guest lectured in the course. And I thought her research was incredible. It was looking at action representations in the brain, and it intersected with not only, cognitive neuroscience, but also with robotics and with philosophy and with all these different fields. I emailed her so many times to try to get into her lab, and eventually I did. So I started working in her lab, and that's where I really kind of fell in love with studying the brain. I got to really get both of the educational side from my classes, but also I really got the lab experience of getting to do things, helping graduate students, helping postdocs, and also getting some independent experience as well. But again, I think really, as I was saying, I was very interested in the brain. I was very curious about it because it controls so much of our lives. It controls pretty much everything. Without a brain, you don't exist. So I always found it very interesting. But I think once I started, so after I finished undergrad, I spent a year at Stanford, and I was studying schizophrenia, and did a little bit sort of different research from what I was doing as an undergrad. During my PhD, I went back to the research I was studying as an undergrad, looking at action representations in the brain. And that's how I intersected my work with empathy, which seems completely removed. But what kind of the neuroscience tells us is that they're very linked. And so most of there's an entire premise called embodiment, which is the idea that our brain is not just our brain, it's intricately tied to our body. And that really shapes our interactions, our lens, all of these things, how we live in the world. And it also helps sort of facilitate a lot of these pro-social constructs like empathy and compassion and all of these other metrics. So that's how I got into it. I thought it was a beautiful story that I was learning about during my PhD. And then that put not just the curiosity, but the meaning for me in terms of why I was studying the brain.
I guess another question I have for you is, why is empathy so important? Or is it important?
Yeah, empathy is definitely important. It's incredibly important, right? Because it's almost like almost every issue that exists in the world can be related to some kind of dysfunction in empathy. And even like, people give examples of medicine, like how could that be connected to empathy? But also within the medical system, there's a very important component of empathy that's needed there. So I really think it's one of our most fundamental and important directions for us to really understand.
So are we born with empathy?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So people say in general, so there's many different forms of empathy. It's not one definition. You have more affective empathy, which is more of the feelings and kind of physiological and internal states of the body, and that's present, even in the fetus. But as you develop, you start to get more of this cognitive ability, which is more of this reasoning component, which is kind of thinking about how other people are thinking. And that's considered more of a cognitive form of empathy, which tends to happen later in development. But one of the key things, I think, the way that I like to conceptualize empathy is you see it very early in development. So you see people think that human beings emerge very selfishly and we're only thinking about ourselves, but you see really a lot of really early empathic behaviors present in kids at a very, very young age.
Well, you know what I really find interesting when I think about this one, when you think about the relationship of empathy to our human evolution and just survival, and they've done studies with animals that actually have exhibited what we would see as empathy.
Yes.
Why is that so important?
You're saying why is it important for us to look at animals, or why is it important?
Why is it? I guess the bigger question is, why is it so important that we have an environment where empathy can develop? You were saying before that everybody's born with empathy. How do you nurture that environment? How can you create an environment where that thrives? And I guess the second part of that is, and we had this discussion, we'll talk about it later. Sometimes people can, as we get older, your empathy may wane. Yeah. Because certain things may shut it off. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's the distinction that I like to make between humanity and society. So our inbuilt humanity, we have pro-social tendencies as human beings. We have a system that interconnects us with other people called the mirror neuron system or action observation network. We use the same circuitry when we think about ourselves as we do for other people in our brain. So our biology is inherently kind of linked to this shared mapping between the self and the other, which really ties into this idea that we are social and interconnected as a species. But I think as we age, presumably, and also just with all the kind of stuff in the world and in life, that can obviously make us kind of more hardened, and society can really have these negative effects. So I think we have to always make that distinction between humanity versus society. Humanity, the biology, is beautiful. Society has some stuff that we have to deal with, and that can affect our inner capacities and things like that.
And your current research is specifically about what is it specifically about? Are you measuring a certain thing, or what are you specifically studying?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of kind of different projects right now. I would say the central theme around all of them is some aspect of pro-social and empathic tendencies in human beings. I study this from the action side. I study this from the more high-level side, so looking at like kind of like reasoning capacities. I studied this with marginalized groups like unhoused groups, for example. And then kind of recently also intersecting some of our work with what you do, and with all the things the amazing things that you're doing with incarcerated folks. So so I'd say really the central theme is to understand how our brain allows us to empathize, and how we can really facilitate that in numerous ways, whether it's with reasoning or whether it's with using more kind of clinical applications like neuromodulation techniques and things like that.
Have you ever seen a situation or you hear people talk about like, hey, that person has no empathy? Or, a lot of you'll say, hey, obviously that person doesn't have any empathy for the community or society. Do you think that's even possible, or how does that even happen?
Yeah, that's really where that's where I think there's a very strong distinction between humanity and society. Again, this is very high level, but I mean, there are cases like there are psychopaths, right? So those exist. But I mean, one of the ideas for how empathy develops is some degree of it is based on early sensory motor interactions with caregivers. So if you presumably have very, very hands-off or uncaring parents, or a very negative environment growing up, that can really shape your brain development, obviously. But I still don't like to think about the fact that empathy does not exist early on. I really think anyone has the capacity for it. There's a researcher called Jamil Zaki who really says empathy is a skill. It's not a trait. It's something that you learn. So yeah, I mean, so again, it's very broad. It's a very multidimensional construct, but I believe that human beings are more empathic than we think.
So how does empathy relate to pro-social behavior, and how do you see that played out in your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So pro-social behavior, I would say, is a very even broader term than empathy. There's a distinction that's often made in the literature, distinguishing empathy and compassion, which are both pro-social constructs. But empathy is more so the feeling. It's a feeling of either thinking about another person or literally actually feeling what other people are feeling in different environments. Compassion kind of takes it a step further, is my understanding from the definition, which is not just this kind of feeling definition of empathy, but it's also kind of the will to act, the will to help, the will to do something when someone is suffering, and that makes you more compassionate. So they're all different constructs that can be lumped under pro-social behavior. Things like reducing implicit bias can also be considered pro-social behavior.
So we talked about you mentioned the medical field, and I know that they have better outcomes when they have nurses or healthcare practitioners that exhibit empathy. So they have a lot of training around that for in the healthcare profession. How do you, when you are brought to a group, or if somebody asks you, hey doctor, I have a group of folks that I think would really benefit from your studies and what you're studying, and how can I encourage pro-social behavior in our group? What kind of ideas or what kind of things do you tell people that would be a good idea to help develop those kind of skills?
I mean, I think the number one thing, no matter what, in any context, whether it's in like a therapy session or whether it's just in real life, whether you're teaching, the number one predictor, I would say, would be listening to other people. Everybody comes with their own set of experiences, their own backgrounds, and it's very important to hear other people, no matter what you're doing, whether you're in control of the room, let's say you're teaching, or whether you're just a participant. Voices should be heard in those contexts. So I think listening is very important. Listening across the board, I would say that's the number one thing in my perspective.
Obama once said that he thought one of the most critical, or one of the things that are really lacking in society, there's an empathy gap.
Yes.
And when you specifically talk about when you have people from, it doesn't really matter what political aisle you're on, if you're not having the empathetic, looking at it with the empathetic eyes. And some people can say, and some people argue, well, if you're empathetic, you're weak. That's a sign of weakness, which every neuroscientist that I've ever spoken to, and every academic, and if you really do a deep dive on it, it's actually not a weakness at all. It's actually quite the opposite. um, how can you develop a better lens, or how can we develop a better lens when we're looking at issues to, I guess, make sure that we're looking at it through the more empathetic eyes in some ways? And you talked about like the societal stuff that comes in, kind of muddies the water. How can we kind of wade through that to make sure that we're not allowing all the societal factors to really negatively in some ways, or cloud our decision making, is the best way for me to say it.
So I think this is some of the work I'm doing right now, which is doing this toolkit that we've been talking about, which is to bring awareness into our innate humanity. So from neuroscience, we know, as we were just talking about, we know that human beings are inherently have these pro-social tendencies. We have systems that interconnect us. And as I was saying, it really shaped my perspective and gave me purpose during my PhD to really understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. It was like like a very strong clicking moment. And that is really important for people to know, because it's incredible how people just reverse the idea. They really think that human beings are, it's the reverse. They think human beings are inherently selfish, they're self-interested, and we have no capacity for good, when actually it's humanity, again, is great. It's that society makes us do horrible things, but we have to remember and tune back into our innate kind of pro-social capacity. So I think that's really important for people to know. I think that's the first step, is people have to know that this is the case. And then from there, I think that we have to kind of put ourselves in environments where we are diverse, where we engage with people of different backgrounds, we hear different perspectives, because really, like, ignorance is one of the most dangerous things that we can do. So it's very, very important to be aware of everyone and people's backgrounds and all these things. Some possible answers there.
So let me ask you, Akila, like you said, like society muddies it. Can you give me kind of an examples of, like, not that you don't have to like be any specific, like some serious things that have went on, but how does society muddle it? Like what kind of noise comes in that clouds this?
Oh, this is going to get everywhere. Start with capitalism. But really, I mean, everything, right? Everything is pitted in society to kind of pit people against each other. Society doesn't promote, especially, I'm not going to get into capitalism and all these, things, but especially in typically capitalistic environments, that's what happens. So society is not really, I would say in a lot of ways it's not built for this, but it can improve. So that's not to say that there can't be hope and the ability to improve. It just takes people going outside the box and understanding that this is really a core problem. I think it's a core problem for so many, if not the majority of the ills that we're facing right now.
So are there any neural differences between people who engage in a lot of pro-social behaviors and those who don't?
There's a lot. Yes, there's a lot. So I mean, so one example to think about this is that if we go to Daniel Kahneman's work, he has this very kind of famous distinction between two types of thinking fast and slow. I think we've talked about this before. It's a very, very fundamental premise, early book you read during your PhD, that distinguishes more of this type 1, so more of this kind of immediate reactionary responses to things, versus type 2, which is more of this deliberate and kind of cognitive and slower type of processing. And typically he argues that you need a balance between both systems. So your type 1 system, let's say someone's in pain, you would immediately feel that pain. You immediately want to kind of do something, but it can quickly become overwhelming to you, where you start to actually, you can have, somatic pain and psychosomatic pain. Type 2 is, if you have too much of that, so too much of this, you see someone, but then you really think about it, you're not engaging the feeling mechanism. You're more so like, oh man, that person's in pain. And you kind of hyper tune into type 2. That's also not great, because that typically he's associated those kinds of thinking purely of just type 2 with more of like psychopathy and sociopathy. So we need a balance between both of those systems. We need a balance between the feeling as well as a balance between the thinking.
So how are you measuring that? You said you use MRI, and there's a functional MRI. How do you measure empathy? What kind of test do you use to measure empathy?
Yeah, there's a lot of tests. I realized, sorry, I just didn't answer your question. Sorry, my brain is like is on a different planet today. What I wanted to say with that example though before was that the point of that was to say that we can actually look at people's brains, and we can look when they think more on this type 2 type of processing, more of this mentalizing is thinking about other people. More of these systems tend to get engaged versus more of your affective, like insula or amygdala or more subcortical structures. And it's not a one-to-one mapping, but you can really get the sense of the differential recruitment of these systems. Yeah, but then, so in terms of assessments, there's a lot of different assessments. I would say that there's a lot of room for improvement. That's kind of where the field is. There's assessments, but we need better assessments. Typically we use some combination of behavioral assessments, which are like survey measures. A prevalent one is the interpersonal reactivity index. There's also the empathy quotient is another kind of prevalent one. There's a bunch of other ones that people use, and these are assessing more of these dimensions of empathy that feed into empathy as a multifactorial construct. So things like perspective taking, empathic concern, fantasizing, all of these different dimensions feed into it. And in terms of other assessments, there's tests that you can do to measure empathy. So people look at altruistic generosity as a proxy for empathic tendencies. A prevalent one is this game called the dictator game, which looks at your allocation, your monetary allocation to different groups as a function of the cost to yourself. So how much would you give to another group if you're allotted a certain money, but you would lose that money? And then typically the brain mapping techniques and the stimulation techniques are more of methods. They don't really tell you anything. They just tell you what correlates are involved in this, but those are just correlates. They're not, we can't really say much. We have to associate them with a lot of other measures to get a better sense of what's going on.
So when you talk about prosocial behavior, can you give me examples of prosocial behavior?
Yeah. So, I mean, it can range, right? There's so many definitions of what it could be. It could be like helping your neighbor, your old neighbor, open the door for her. It could be helping someone with groceries, or it could go all the way up to like sacrificing your life for your job, for your country, for all these things. So, yeah, it's a wide ranging thing, but I'd say every day we all encounter some form of this in our daily lives.
And what does neuroscience tell us about why some people are naturally more empathetic or altruistic than others?
Yeah, you're saying why does it tell us that, or how does it tell us that?
What does neuroscience tell us about that? Are people born naturally more empathetic or altruistic? And I think you kind of spoke about a little bit before that. Are there people that are more empathetic or altruistic, and why is that the case, you think? And I think it goes back to what you were saying, the societal factors is probably a big part of it, right?
Yes. Yeah. So there's definitely, so empathy is not like often we measure it with trait assessments. It's not a trait. It's fluid. It changes over time. You know, you can become really unempathic in some domain and then suddenly go back to being empathic. It's all sort of a fluid construct, I guess. But yeah, definitely there's a lot of variability in terms of how empathic people are. And again, empathic is not a unitary construct. We keep saying it because that's how we can talk about it, but it's a lot of different constructs going on within empathy, like emotion and thinking and all these things. So yeah, there's a ton of variability in the population. People often say like a good distinction would be like a mother has a lot of empathic, emotional empathy for her kids and for her family. Like a businessman has more of the cognitive empathy. He knows how to strategize and think, but maybe that emotional feeling for his employees and for other people is not as strong or there.
So how might your research, I guess, impact educational systems, workplaces, societal policies? And if you think about that, and I think that's what the point Obama was trying to make is that you have to kind of have empathy when you look at new policies and procedures and new laws and the ways that approach things. How are you using your research to impact it? You mentioned some of the things you're doing, but how will your research impact other parts of society?
Yeah, I think I used to be someone who thought of neuroscience as sort of a very theoretical topic of study. And as I was telling you, I joined this program at UCLA that intersects neuroscience and society. And that actually like totally reframed my way of thinking, in that we shouldn't be scared to apply some of our work in society. A lot of times applied societal applications of neuroscience, people think it's diluting the science, or it's it's not as strong theoretically or all these things. But I think everyone, especially in the climate that we're living today in, we have an obligation, especially on these topics, to help where we can, in terms of it's not just long-term, help that we get with theory, but it's also in our immediate environments. These things can really, really help people. So I think it involves, obviously, I don't work so much on this side, but it involves a lot of discussions with stakeholders, with policymakers. Sometimes people just give more value to improving perceptions of dehumanized or stigmatized groups if they see a brain image. That's like literally all it is. And it's unfortunate, like we have to have proof like that, but these things can really help people, especially where we come from on the science side.
So why isn't empathy a weakness?
Why isn't a weakness? I mean, it's a huge strength. It's I mentioned Jamil Zaki already, but he has this book called Hope for Cynics. And in that book, he talks about how on most tests, like if you give people who are cynical, we often think of cynics as being much smarter. If you don't trust someone, you're more intelligent. All these things. You can kind of sniff out someone who's not doing the correct thing. But in his book, he talks about that people who are actually more cynical tend to score lower on almost every metric possible, every academic metric. So they score lower on math tests. They score lower on, English tests, things like that. So it's actually like tied to like being less smart, quote unquote, smart, if you assess it in that way. And also it's sort of like, yes, you might have a lot of experiences where you're too trusting or you're too empathic and you get burned along the way, by someone. But for the majority of those experiences, you don't. And that's what you have to remember. Versus if you just put yourself in an isolated cage and you just don't want to trust anybody, you're never going to have any experience and you're just going to be like locked in a little box.
Yeah, I really love. I love what you said right now, and I really think it really highlights how important empathy is, and its role, and when you juxtapose that with what you said about cynics, how does culture play into empathy?
Yeah, there is a lot with culture, actually. There's a classic distinction culturally, which I think people have a lot of nuances within this distinction, but a very gross distinction is that in Eastern cultures, there tends to be more of a collectivistic sense of identity. So you see this, in different religions. You also see this in terms of the spiritual directions that come from these cultures. You see it in the way that they treat society and people around them. There's a more sense of shared self. And this is also, there's studies showing this in the brain too. In Western cultures, there's more kind of a individualistic and solipsistic tendency. But again, there's a lot of nuance here, but this often tends to be the classic distinction that people make, is that we see more individualistic tendencies, especially in America.
So when you look at culture, obviously empathy exists in all cultures because it's part of survival. Um, so how do you apply your research, or how have you thought about like applications beyond the United States? Like, can you apply this? How would you apply it to other cultures? Would you have to change it and go about it differently? Like, how do you approach that as a researcher?
Yeah, that's a great question. Personally, I've stayed in the US in all my work, because I feel like the US needs a lot of help. Like we're in a crisis right now in many ways. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's you can go anywhere you want and do this research. Human beings are human beings. It doesn't matter where we're from. Yes, there's different influences at play in terms of our culture, but at our core, we're all very, very tightly linked.
So when it comes to and we've had this discussion before, empathy fatigue.
Yes.
Is empathy fatigue a thing? And then how do you deal with it? How do you know if you're having empathy fatigue, for one? And then what kind of things can you do to combat empathy fatigue?
Yes, empathy fatigue is a thing. It is a very big thing. It's commonly like classic examples in healthcare. So like medical burnout is a common, because they see so much of stuff in their job, and often people can become desensitized. They're just burned out. They gave too much of empathy. The counterexample is people, if you see an unhoused person on the street just dying, it's, no one's doing anything for them. They're just literally like sprawled on the street. Many times as a self-protective measure, you don't even look at them or you don't acknowledge them, because it can cause you too much pain, or it can even cause you burnout, because we see so much of it, especially in LA. There's a lot of homeless and unhoused populations that we, if we attended to every single unhoused human, we would really deplete a lot of our capacity and feelings and all these things. So yeah, it's definitely a huge thing.
So what kind of suggestions do you have to fight that, to make sure you can kind of balance those things out?
Yes. I like the path of equanimity, which is not ignoring people who are in need when you see them in daily life. Many times we're thinking long term. We're like, well, I'm not going to help this person because I'm going to think about how my work or how my research or how other things in my life will help a lot of people, almost in like a utilitarian sense. But I think it's really important, even in the day-to-day, anybody you encounter, just like take the time to engage and stop. Your work is important. It's very important, but it's not like the end all be all. It's one thing in your life, but people are really our sense of, you are an extension of me. Everyone around me is an extension of each other. So we should try to be there as much as we can. But saying that, we shouldn't deplete ourselves. If it starts to become overwhelming or too much, you have to know also when to set boundaries and take the time for yourself to go back to your life.
So I get to have a personal question here. How has your research changed you personally,
Oh,
and how
yes.
you see the world and interact with people?
It changed my whole life. It really did. I am so grateful to do the work that we're doing. Like I was saying, I started my PhD a lot more self-interested. I was like 23. I was, all these things. But when I learned about the fact that our biology tells us so many great things about our humanity, and actually, this is why I think it's important that people know this, because I didn't know this. I only learned this in my PhD. I only learned this because of what I do. But the majority of the population, people don't really know this. And so it really gave me meaning and purpose. I stopped thinking as individualistically as I tended to do at that age, and started thinking more collectivistically and thinking more about other people, and stopped focusing on individual metrics like publications or citations, but started thinking about how we can really do good research and connect with other people and all of that.
So this is another interesting question. People always ask me this. Is there any type of myth that you want to debunk about empathy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I liked actually what you were saying about people think empathy is weak. I think that's the best example, because it goes back to even the inherent femininity associated with empathy and how that's looked down upon in some sense in society. So I think it's just so important to really bring awareness to the fact that it is a strength. It is a huge strength. It is a strength to care about other people.
So now here's going to be your hardest questions for the day. What is your favorite guilty pleasure food wise?
This is the hardest question. Favorite guilty pleasure food wise. I like a lot of chocolate.
Oh, you're a chocolate person.
Chocolate.
That's your weakness. If you could meet one person in the world, it could be anyone throughout history, anybody throughout history, who would it be and what would you say?
I think Martin Luther King Jr. I think he's incredible, incredible man. Yeah, I don't know what I would say. I have no idea what I would say, but I would just want to meet him. I think that would be amazing. He's so amazing.
And if there's a message that you would like to give our listeners about the role of your brain in social lives and how important the brain is to the way we interact with the world, what would that message be?
I think maybe you said it in the question, but your brain is your lens of the world. And it's really important to keep it strong. And there's a lot of stuff in society, but just keep the brain strong and remember the importance of humanity.
And let me ask you, this is going to be the last question here.
Yeah.
Because it kind of feeds into this, because people always ask about this all the time. And we always know that when we go, work, we kind of know the typical stuff where we go to the gym to work out, right? Because we can physically see when we go to the gym and lift weights or we take a walk, you can physically see what's going on. As we know, like dementia and, there's a lot of disease and a lot of issues go on with the brain as you get older. Can you tell me the importance? And I love what you said about just keeping that. It's a lens to the word and keeping it healthy.
Yes.
What kind of things can you do to keep your brain healthy?
There's a lot, and it's not just in the brain, it's also in the body. So as you were just saying, going to the gym, staying fit, that's a very good predictor of brain health, is how physically active you are. Even just taking walks is important for that. And then I think having a routine is really important. That's kind of a common thing that most people experience in their lives that changes their brain. Having a good routine. The keyword is good. It has to be a good routine, productive, kind of, keeps yourself feeling good. I I'd say those two are very important. What I like to do, my biggest thing for brain health is reading. I love to read. I love to like, the analogy is always like, you physically keep active, but you also mentally have to keep active as well. And so reading really helps me, at least.
Yeah, I think like you said, it's like critical, not only the going to the gym and so forth and eating right and making those connections with people
Yeah.
and obviously having a very good, I think if you see those blue zones, you talk about people have a long life, they have strong community, but that goes a lot, that connects a lot with empathy, right? Building that community, being there for one another. But like you said, it's just people, it's so important to continuing your education. And it could be like reading a book or learning to play an instrument,
Yes.
or it's just constantly trying to going to a Broadway show, doing things to constantly expand your mind. And I think we had this conversation. It's like it's one area of the body. Most of our body as we get older, it starts to atrophy, but the brain, the neurons can actually keep growing. It's like
Yes.
the only part of your body when they've done research where, hey, guess what? These synapses can keep growing. Your body, your neurons can keep
Yes.
growing. These synapses keep shooting. So I think a lot of people think, or they just there's many people that I've spoken to is like, you know what? I'm older now. I've retired, or you know what? I don't need to read anymore. And they just kind of just sit around the house, or they don't do a lot intellectually to kind of stimulate themselves and stimulate their brain. And I think, like you said, it's so critical to just, go to the library,
Yes.
grab a book. I mean, you have to work on your mind as well as the outside of your body. So you could take a walk, go sit at the park and read. Something as simple as that, but just constantly keeping yourself going. And I have my mom is a good example of that. She never stops. She's teaches herself how to play the ukulele, and she's
Wow.
constantly reading different books. And so she's just constantly engaging with her brain. Her brain's never slowing down, and cognitively, she's just as sharp as when I was growing up, just because she stays on it. So,
Nice.
is that kind of been your experience as well?
Yeah. I agree. I totally agree. I think that that's so important, and it's also really inspiring when you see older people doing it, because it's possible. So yeah, I think those are the most fundamental things that really, and it's also linked to a lot of clinical conditions like depression and all these things. If you don't do these things, these symptoms can get worse of these conditions. So yeah, I agree. I think
And
that's
where do you see your work going from here? And then how do people, if they want to follow your research or do more research in the area, what do you recommend?
yeah. So I think I would say the central theme of my work is to push focus on positive neuroscience. That's what the field is called, positive or humanistic neuroscience. And I really should have said this at the beginning of the podcast, but the focus of positive/humanistic neuroscience is to reframe our thinking of the brain as a system that constantly goes wrong, as we do in clinical psychology, for example. And not to say that's not important, that is one very important dimension, but positive/humanistic neuroscience really kind of flips the script and the narrative to say, well, there's a lot about our innate processes in our brain that are really great and evolutionarily have this adaptive function, and things like prosociality is adaptive. And so how can we really understand this and bring awareness to that? And that's really where I see the next set of my work going. I'm intersecting a lot of different methods. We do some AI work, we do work with music, we do work with all of these different things. And I think with AI, it's actually a next big frontier that we collaborate with DeepMind at Google. And we're trying to look at these systems to figure out how we can really align it. I would say the term is align it with human goodness in that way.
Well, I appreciate you so much for being here today. It's been a great interview. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're an extremely busy person, and you're doing amazing things in your research.
Thank you.
And yeah, just keep trying to change the world. And thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you. So I guess the best way just is if somebody wants to go and do their own research or look up the Brain Research Institute at UCLA. They can kind of follow some of your research, and I know you're also at USC and
Yeah.
helping them out with some projects as well. And again, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you.
Of course. Thank you for having me. You're also doing amazing stuff. So glad we could talk to each other and have this conversation.
Well, thank you again. And until next time, until the next podcast and our next amazing guest, take care and see you next time.
Nice to see you.
Take care. Bye-bye.